So I want to pick up in Esther chapter 4. We'll be there for just a few minutes just to sort of set our feet a little bit, and then we'll move forward into chapter 5. So Esther chapter 4, and if somebody would, let's just to remind ourselves of where we are, somebody read, if you would, verses Esther 4, verse 14. Verse 14.
I'll do it.
Okay.
If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
So, I mean, probably the most famous verse in the book of Esther, and one that I think we'll be coming back to quite a lot as we finish up the book over the next couple of weeks. And I just want to sort of remind you of what the situation is, right? So Haman, the king's kind of right-hand man, has this grudge against Mordecai, but not just against Mordecai, against the Jews. And he has paid a lot of money so that to convince the king to proclaim this edict against the Jewish people, that on this day, the last month of the year, that the Jews will be just eliminated. He uses 3 verbs, and it comes down to killed, destroyed, annihilated, something like that. It's this sort of complete genocide of the Jewish people is what is in view. Mordecai gets wind of it, and Esther is the one who is best placed, in his view, to have some influence. How did Esther come to this position? He mentions her royal position, her being queen. How did she come to this position? Just to remind ourselves.
I think it was God's providence.
Okay, we think it was God's providence.
Everybody disagree with it.
But how did it happen?
She was brought to the king's palace with other attractive women from, I suppose, the whole kingdom. And one by one, the king tried them out, I would suppose, and decided that Esther was the one that pleased him the most, and he chose her to be his next queen because he had deposed the other one.
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at that situation, I mean, you might even be tempted to sort of look down on Esther a little bit, right? She got to where she is in our world. We'd say, she got to where she is on her good looks and maybe other stuff, right? And and so we would sort of maybe even look down on that as a way of advancing for a woman. And I think rightly so. I hope in our world we don't expect that, though we know things like that happen. But Mordecai gives us sort of a different view of the situation here, right? It may not just be random. Now, Mordecai doesn't seem to know for sure, right? He's not tuned into God, it doesn't seem, in any particular way. He just says, what if? What if maybe you are where you are for just this moment? What if maybe all of this up to this point has been about that? You being in position to step in and save your people.
I reread that section again today, and it, at first I thought that Mordecai, introduced, was like, yeah, sure, I'm promoting Esther, but that's not what the text says. The text says that she was taken. So,
Yes.
she's not, you know, she's not entering a beauty contest on her own or anything like that. She was taken by the king, and they had really no alternative.
That's
And
right.
that sort of like parallels the Joseph story. The Joseph story isn't about necessarily forgiveness, avoiding adultery, and even suffering and exaltation. But Joseph says, you intended this for evil, God used it for good.
Right.
In other words, I can't say that God put Esther there, but I mean, he wanted her there, but he used this opportunity for her.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's a little much to say God made her go through this just to put. I mean, that kind of is a little cringy to think about, that. But however it happened, what Mordecai's statement does is it throws this whole thing in a different light. Maybe it's not just. God has used these circumstances, like with Joseph. God has used these circumstances, many of which have been beyond your control, to get you into this place, perhaps, where you can have an opportunity to save Israel. Now, there's no guarantee, right? We know that. Esther says that. Esther says, look, I don't know if that's going to work. I might just as well be killed when I walk into the throne room. And that'll sort of throw a wrench in the plans, right? We don't know. We don't know how it's going to work out. I mean, we kind of know, but we don't know, right? And Esther certainly didn't know, and Mordecai certainly didn't know. But maybe that's what is going on here. Have you ever felt like you were in just the right place at just the right time for exactly what needed to be done? I don't think Ron is here tonight, but Ron has mentioned the job that he sort of, found himself in, and sort of the conversations he's had with other people who have kind of said, well, you earned that, you got that because, and the thought was, well, yeah, maybe, but maybe also God put me there. God had something to do with that. That's often the way life works, right? We don't always know. So we talked a little bit about the difference between, as we started this, between an enchanted world and a non-enchanted world. Do you remember that? A lot of the Bible is sort of gives us this view of an enchanted world because God acts in direct, unquestionable, unambiguous ways, right? Jesus stills the storm. God sends fire down on the sacrifice of Elijah. A pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire guide the people through the wilderness after God has parted the Red Sea for them. He gives them manna in the desert. All these things that I mean, it's unquestionable. God is acting, right? A lot of the Bible's like that. But then some of the Bible is unenchanted. Esther is one of those places. But we don't see God acting in this unambiguous, obvious way. We got to read between the lines. And that's, as Christians, that's really often the way we read Esther, right? We just sort of read between the lines to see some things happening, kind of like Mordecai does here. Who knows? Maybe, just possibly, he's qualifying it, right? He's not sure, but maybe, just possibly, God has you here. Yeah.
He's amazing to me that he is sure that deliverance will arise.
Yes. I'm sure deliverance is going to arise from someone. Why is he sure of that? That's a reasonable question to ask. Why is Mordecai sure that deliverance for the Jews is going to arise from someplace.
He must be familiar with God's promises.
Okay,
So he has some faith somewhere along the line.
we're his people. We're his covenant people. Now, I don't know exactly what Mordecai knows about scripture, about God. I don't know what his faith looks like. We don't really get much of a glimpse of it, except for perhaps here. But he knows God is faithful. He's made a covenant with his people, and he is faithful. And he's going to be faithful to that covenant. He doesn't know how, why, with whom, but he knows that God is somehow going to save Israel. I think that's why he's convinced. Now, he didn't say all that, but I think that's why he's convinced.
Well, they're supposed to go back. That's been part of the.
Yeah, right,
process.
right.
They know they're not gonna be there forever, so if the people were totally annihilated, that would be impossible.
And some have already gone back, some have already returned to the promise. So, yeah,
I think you can see that they have some faith between the lines.
there's,
Those
yeah,
things you're talking about here. And,
behind the scenes, there's something happening, right? And we just don't know what. Yeah, go ahead.
I got a little quick note here that says that the Jews felt God had hidden his face from them. Maybe they're kind of like embarrassed or something. And so that's why God is not mentioned in here. But he's operating, I think. And I think that they have faith too. But like I say, they were kind of ashamed of God. He hadn't spoke to them in a long time or something. And they were just holding back. So that's one theory on it.
One of the reasons that I think Esther still kind of speaks to, has spoken to people through the centuries in different situations in different cultures is because this is kind of how life is sometimes, right? I mean, we don't know God. I can't. There are times in my life where I've said, wow, God really, that's what God did. God did that. But I'm not sure I could prove it. I'm not sure I can point to it and say, see, obviously God did that. I think like Ron's experience, most of my experiences like that, someone else could just as reasonably say, no, that's not why. It's because of this. God often acts in our world in these kind of ambiguous ways through people who are in those situations where he needs. Is that always a good place to be? Where when God puts you in this place, possibly where you can make, is that always an easy, comfortable place to be?
No. It's not. And what I was thinking about what you were saying, I think I personally can relate to the book of Esther in that this is how I think God operates.
Yeah.
And it's living by faith.
Yeah.
So we don't always know, and that's what we put in well, I hope, this might be from God and that might, but it's living by faith, understanding that we are God's chosen people now by grace, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's more often I don't see the T's crossed and the I's dotted. It's by faith because how he's acted in the past. And when I look at my life, behind, I see that was God. That had to be God. I prayed about that. And I often tell the story of when I think I've shared it with the group before. You were saying, has God ever done something like wrong? I've prayed that I would go for a job interview and God would I would get the job the same day. And I remember telling my sisters that, and they go, that's not how it works.
Right.
You're not going to get the job on the same day. And I said, well, I'm going to pray. I'm just going to pray and believe it. And sure enough, I went, had an interview to be a director at some school and school counselor. I was on the road driving from somewhere and get a call from the person and say, hey, we want to hire you. I was more excited that I got the offer the same day than getting the job. And I was like, see, and I was just so fired up. But it's by my thing. It's everybody else would say, it was a coincidence or whatever, but it's living by faith. And I think that's what I see with Mordecai and how he speaks to Esther. That we don't always know. It has to be our faith.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
I was thinking about they fasted and they prayed together. And I feel like God was present in this situation. That's what I believe. He was there. even though he's not mentioned. But he was in the midst of everything that went on.
It's interesting. So, you know, you have this reference to the fasting, and that's all that's specifically, explicitly mentioned. The Greek, I mentioned to you the Greek version of Esther that has 100 and I think it's 106 more verses than the Hebrew version, and both of them have both. The Greek version has prayers from both Mordecai and Esther that kind of make explicit some of the things that we're talking about. Perhaps, Josh, would you mind pulling up that slide? I'm assuming you're still over there. I can't see. And the first is the prayer of Mordecai. And it's just interesting to see, you know, just the way he, just the way this, if this is somebody filling in the blanks or filling in the gaps a little bit, it's just interesting. You made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing. Whoops, back up. You made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing under heaven. Verse 3 says, you are Lord of all, and there is no one who can resist you, the Lord. You know all things. You know, Lord, that it was not out of, so he explains why he didn't bow down to Haman. I would have gladly kissed the soles of his feet for the salvation of Israel, he goes on to say. I like the end, verse 8, spare your people. Verse 9, do not spurn your portion, which you redeemed for yourself out of the land of Egypt. Hear my prayer. Have pity on your inheritance and turn our mourning into feasting, that we may live to sing praise to your name, Lord. Do not silence the mouths of those who praise you. Just really interesting. And I think wrestling a little bit, perhaps, with some of these questions that we're asking, you know, wanting a more explicit trust and more explicit faith. Go on to the next slide, Josh. This is Esther's prayer. Interesting. She begins, you alone are our king. Help me who am alone and have no help but you, for I am taking my life in my hand. From my birth, I have heard among my people that you chose Israel from among all nations, and our ancestors from among all their forebears as a lasting inheritance. This inheritance thing comes up several times. Go on to the next slide if you want to, Josh, if you would. Do not relinquish your scepter to those who are nothing. Do not let our foes gloat over our ruin, but turn their own counsel against them and make an example of the one who began this against us. Make yourself known. Interestingly, the last part of the prayer, she talks about how she hates the pomp of the lawless and abhors the bed of the uncircumcised. That's interesting, right? You know that I am under constraint, that I abhor the sign of grandeur that rests on my head when I appear in public. I don't like my crown. I don't wear it when I don't have to. I don't, eat the food I've never eaten at the table of Haman, nor have I graced the banquet of the king or drunk the wine of libations. That's wine that's been given to idols. Anyway, some of what we're talking about, the Greek version of Esther seems to try to make more explicit, which is interesting. You can pull out that for a minute, Josh, if you would. Go back just to the regular screen. So let's go to chapter 5 and pick up the narrative again, beginning in verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. Judge, I'm sorry, actually go and pull those slides back up if you would, because there's some interesting architectural stuff in the Louvre from this era of the Persian Empire, including some reconstructions of what the palace looked like. So first of all, the first thing you see on your screen there is a reconstruction of what the palace at Susa probably looked like, something pretty close to this. It was on this mound, and archaeological excavations tell you some stories, but it was on this raised, this like artificially created plateau. So it was up elevated above everybody. You see the King's Gate there, that little building at the very edge there, right next to the walkway. That's the King's Gate. That's the gate that everybody's talking about, the sort of gatehouse structure that leads into the palace. Go ahead, Josh, next slide. This is the audience chamber as it's been reconstructed. This is something like what Esther would have been standing in as she came before the king. Pretty intimidating, no? to walk in there and probably, you know, officials and guards and whatnot all around, and to walk into this very imposing looking structure, imposing looking building, to go and make her plea before the king. And look at the scale of it. It's huge, right? It's a massive building. Next slide, Judge. And that's like the entryway to the palace. I included that because you can see the little, there's a name for them, the bull people there on either side of the door.
Winged bulls.
What's that?
Winged man bulls.
Yeah, winged bulls. There's a name for it now. I can't think of what it is. It's sort of like a cherubim, actually. But if you then look down, you see people standing beside it. So it gives you some idea of the scale of the things. It's again massive complex here that was actually built mostly by Xerxes' father, Darius, and then added on to by Xerxes. There was also a harem there, a place where the wives could live. So quite a place. Anyway, just to sort of let you envision a little bit what we're seeing. Okay, Josh, thanks.
Lamasu.
What's that?
That's what they call it, Lamasu.
Lamasu, thank you, Lamasu. I couldn't think of it. Yes, Lamasu. So again, Esther chapter 5, and we'll pick up in verse 4. So verse 3, the king has said, you know, what's your request, Esther? Well, up to half the kingdom. That's being polite. It's sort of court language. He's not really going to give her half the kingdom. She wouldn't dare ask. But it's a way of saying, I'm feeling generous, Esther. What can I do for you? How can I help?
It'd be repeated a few more times.
It will be repeated several more times. You're right. So verse 4, Esther chapter 5, verse 4. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I've prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. Now let's pause just a minute. Why does she do this? Makes for a good story, right? Because ratchets up the tension every time. But why does she do this?
Well, I think she hasn't seen him in quite a while.
I hadn't seen him in a while, so maybe she's feeling like maybe it'd be better to sort of rekindle and reacquaint myself with him and him with me. Yeah. It might be too, one of the terms that's used, phrases that's used is literally it's a banquet of wine. The wine might be a contributing factor to the whole thing, right? I mean, you know, get him loose enough, and maybe he'll be more willing to help me out.
I think it's interesting to note that she is fasting.
Yes.
She's offering this big banquet and she can't eat anything. Just this little sideline here, but she's in a period of fasting here.
Yeah.
And that's a very Jewish thing, you know. So that, again, that shows that she's got some faith, I think, and some Jewish teaching along the line, you know.
So Verse 6, Esther chapter 5, verse 6. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom." There it is again. "It will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Once again, right? She pushes it off. I've read some people who said she lost her nerve. She got up there in front of him and said, "I want you to come to a banquet." And then at the first banquet, she said, "I want you to come to another banquet." I don't know that we should necessarily assume she lost her nerve. I think perhaps she sort of planned it this way. This was what she intended to do. This is the way you curry favor with rulers, right? This is what you do. You make them feel important. You wine them. You dine them. You impress them. This is the way it works. And so she's kind of playing that game a little bit. One side note, as we think about this, what do people do generally when they are being treated unjustly? How do people respond to that? There's complaint. That's one way to respond, right? What's another way to respond?
Anger.
Anger. We've seen these things in Esther, right? We've seen Mordecai demonstrating his grief and his pain and his anger over what this situation is. We've seen him walking around in sackcloth and ashes. We've seen that. But eventually, to effect change, one thing that has to happen is somebody's got to get in front of the people who make decisions, who are in power. And they have to get them to see and to recognize. So sometimes the rest of us don't like that, right? We don't like those strategies. We don't like it when people demonstrate. We don't like it when people get mad. But this is what you see in Esther. This is what you see in most cultures where people are facing injustice. They complain. They demonstrate. They show what's happening. They try to let people see it. And they got to get it in front of the people who can affect change. And so that's kind of what Esther's doing, right? She's the one who's going to get this in front of the king to make a change. Okay, so verse 9 then. I'm talking a lot. Anybody have comments?
And she's also, seems like setting Haman up to feel very confident that she thinks a lot of him, and that the king also does, because it's the king and Haman at both times. Nobody else is asked to participate in this, so he's feeling really kind of puffed up about it.
And that's exactly what we see in verse 9 of chapter 5, right? So Esther chapter 5, verse 9. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. By the way, I watched this week a video on YouTube of a rabbi reading Esther in a synagogue. I love every time I mention Haman. Woo, woo. I mean, it's very demonstrative, and everybody has a lot of fun with it. It's funny. People laugh and smile, but boo! They try to drown out Haman's name every time you mention it. You want to drown out his name. It's a way to sort of keep them involved. I thought about having you say boo every time, but So Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Now, here's where you see the kind of guy Haman is, right? Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person, Queen Esther, invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. Wouldn't you love to hang out with Haman for a little while? Doesn't he sound like a fun guy?
Not really. He got really got to.
He gets everybody together just so he can talk about himself. I've met a few people like that here and there, just so he can talk about all his honor and all his glory. But verse 13 says, all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. This is
he had.
What's
He had
that?
all that. He said he had all that, and he was still concerned about that one person.
That one person who didn't like him,
person.
who didn't kowtow to him, right? That one person who
Yeah.
wouldn't give him what he wanted. This is what greed looks like, right? It's never enough. Greed for
Yeah.
power, greed for money, greed for pleasure, whatever it is, it's never enough. You can never be content. And this is Haman's problem, and this is eventually what leads to his downfall. But it's this refusal to be content with what you have and enjoy it and be thankful for it. He's just got to have more and more. And when one person won't play along, he's furious. Homicide.
And his friends and wife are no good.
And his friends and wife, yeah, Zeresh and all his friends said to him, verse 14, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, it's about 75 feet, I think,
Yeah.
and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. The Hebrew word is wood or tree. Hebrew has a fairly limited vocabulary in a lot of ways, and so the word is just wood or tree. That's the King James version says gallows. Some of the older versions will say gallows. I think I mentioned last week in the ancient Near East they didn't hang people like in the Old West we used to. This is NIV probably describes it pretty well. We know Herodotus talks about the Persians doing exactly this thing. Impaling people on poles, usually after they've already killed them. Usually they're executed and then they're impaled on this pole so that people can, see them and be discouraged from, not playing along.
That's on the Assyrian reliefs.
Yeah, Syrian reliefs. There's one I think actually is it Lachish where
Yeah.
where it's
Lachish.
actually they're impaling some Judeans on the king is portrayed as having Judeans impaled.
I'm just struck in this several times where the king seems to be kind of a nitwit. I mean, he overreacts to everything. And like, Haman asks to have one, person, and then he says, oh, well, let's kill all the king. Oh, sure, what, and then when his queen, he wants her to come and then, he throws her out and has all these, and, now ask to have Mordecai hanged on this pole. And the king is gonna say, oh, why, what, oh, no, go ahead and do it. Yeah, he just seems like,
Airhead.
it's like he.
Easily influenced.
Exactly.
Yeah. We've said before, haven't we, that every time somebody comes to the king with a proposition,
Yeah,
he says yes.
yeah,
He never says no throughout the whole book. Every time somebody comes in and says, hey, why don't you do this? He says, yeah, sure. Sounds good.
something, that would be so absurd and unreasonable like this. Particularly, the killing all the Jewish people in his kingdom. You would think he would wonder why, or what, and it never comes up.
Well, it may say something about kings, right? And absolute power, that this doesn't seem strange at all to him. This doesn't seem to faze him at all. This is just the way it work, way things work. Well, all right, so Haman's all set, right? He's the king, he's going to the banquet. The one person who won't bow down to him is gonna be shish kebab in just a little while, so all is well, right? Haman's got it all wired. Well,
Well, again, I have to just say, like, his friends and his wife.
Yep.
You know. You were saying, you know, he called them to, you know, to brag. Well, why would they be there to listen to someone? They want to be on his good side. They think that, you know.
It might impale me too.
You know, you know, but why would you suggest that to somebody?
It's insane. It's all insane.
The-
And I think that's the point. It's supposed to be insane. We're supposed to go, what?
Mhm.
And that's exactly what happens.
They're gonna have a change in tune the next counseling session.
What's that?
The next counseling session, they're gonna have a change in tune.
Yes, things are gonna go, well, chapter 6 is where things start to go off the rails for him, right? And it
Hey,
begins
Patrick.
with, oh, yes,
I just was reading something in my study Bible here, and I won't read it all because it's rather amusing, but true, I'm sure. It refers to Xerxes as a wild man. There's other historical sources portray Xerxes as a dangerously impulsive king. When a bridge he had ordered built was destroyed in a storm, he commanded that the sea receive 300 lashes, and then had the bridge builders beheaded.
Yikes. Wouldn't you love to work for Xerxes? So that night, chapter 6, verse 1, that night he can't sleep. This is how it starts. There's a whole series of interesting coincidences here that happen for the next few minutes. The king can't sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. So Mordecai had, you may recall, stopped this conspiracy to have him assassinated. And so that was recorded. However, verse 3 says, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. So there's a couple of coincidences, right? He happens to read about Mordecai and realizes we haven't done anything to show our appreciation to Mordecai for this. About that time, somebody shows up in the court, and I don't know if it's announced or something, but the king, verse 4, said, who is in the court? Now, Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he'd set up. So remember, Haman is so anxious to get this done that he goes like first thing at crack of dawn or even before to get to the palace, because he wants to get to the palace first to talk to the king and to ask for this. And it just so happens the king's been reading about what Mordecai has done for him, right? His attendants answered, Haman standing close, bring him in. Verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? And Haman thinks what?
Yeah.
Who would the king want to honor more than me? Haman says. Can't imagine that anyone else might be in view than himself. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king is worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Just incidentally, if somebody says to you, you know, how would you like to be honored? And this is what you come up with, you're a sociopath, okay? I mean, this is nuts. This is absolutely insane. If this is what you come up with, you know, how about a nice gift card? You know, that'd be great. You know, how about, some money, I don't know, a house. No, he wants to be paraded around through the streets on the king's horse, wearing the king's clothes. He wants to play, he's playing dress up. He wants to play dress up as the king for just a little while. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for, drum roll please, Mordecai the Jew. Oof.
Must have hurt.
That must have stung, right? Now, so he's got
Not
it.
only is it not him,
It's
his
the guy,
enemy.
he was just gonna talk to the king about sticking on a pole, you know? To his credit, at least, he doesn't say, well, I was gonna talk to you about Mordecai. Didn't do that.
And the king probably would have been as eager to
And
do
the king,
that
the king,
as
yeah.
he is.
I wouldn't-
After you parade him through the streets, put him on the pole. That's, you know, that's probably what would happen. I don't know. Xerxes is just nuts enough. Anyway, so Haman got the robe and the horse, and he rode Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. Head covered, by the way, we'll see that again in there. And he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, boy, how things change quickly. Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Now, I have some questions.
Why?
They suddenly remember he's
Did they
Jewish.
suddenly, yeah, did they not know that a minute ago, or they said, go have him stuck on a pole? I don't know. I don't know what's changed, but they suddenly it suddenly seems to dawn on them, if maybe they didn't know, that he's Jewish. Although he said, I mean, in the story, Haman says, calls him that Jew Mordecai. But here they say, since he's Jewish, you will not be able to stand against him. You'll surely come to ruin. You said why?
Yeah.
Why is that? I think this is a powerful statement, especially from the mouth of a non-Jew, of the chosenness of God's people and the faithfulness of God, right? I think it's a way of talking about God takes care of his people. And, you know, if you're on the wrong side of that, you're in deep trouble. Without actually saying it that way, but that seems to be sort of it reminds me a little bit of like during the Exodus, Rahab, right? Remember the story of Rahab? Rahab is just convinced, absolutely convinced that God's going to do what God says he's going to do. And she wants to be sure she's on the right side when that happens. And I think that's kind of the same sort of thing happening here. This affirmation that the Jews are God's people and God is going to look out for them and take care of them. And if you're standing against them, Haman's sorry, you're going to come to ruin.
It's interesting, the king says Mordecai, do all this to Mordecai the Jew.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just called Mordecai before,
Yeah.
but now it's Mordecai the Jew.
Mordecai Jew, and Haman said when he was talking to the family before, that Jew Mordecai, you know, I can't stand him. He won't do what I want him to do.
Yeah, but that is interesting because, you know, would he remember that, you know, 2 days ago or whatever, he signed the edict that, you know, all the Jews were gonna die. Oh, but we're gonna put this.
No, apparently not.
Yeah.
Apparently he does not remember that. Apparently that does not
Yeah.
enter into his thinking, his little pea brain. While they're still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. And so we get to the second banquet. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. As they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It'll be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Verse 3, Esther finally says, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. Esther said, an adversary, this vile Haman. Bum, bum, bum. Right now things are bad.
But the king was the one who signed the edict. Now, he doesn't even, it never even registered on him.
Maybe he just signing stuff,
Yeah.
you know.
It was the wife.
Doesn't hear it.
Signing things left and right. I don't know. I mean,
Well-
it's no sense.
Remember,
Go ahead.
he bribed him with that $70 million,
Stacks of money,
$75 of silver.
Yeah, stacks of money, but perhaps all of it.
Was it
he was
75
thinking
talents?
at the moment.
75 talents. 17 millions.
What's that, Josh?
Isn't that how prejudice works in real life? too?
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of evaporates when someone who represents everything you hate does something kind for you, or helps you, or saves you. It makes it hard to continue to hold those beliefs even while you're acting them.
You're absolutely right. I think often prejudice doesn't really survive personal acquaintance, right? I mean, you know somebody. I mean, maybe you can say things like, well, they're the exception. But
I think that's kind of what's going on.
yeah, I mean, you know, and I think Xerxes had nothing against the Jewish people per se. It was Haman's grudge. And now that he realizes Esther's one of them, and you know, he changes his mind. Then Haman was terrified before the king and fled. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. There is a midrash, midrash is an interpretation of a book of the Bible, a Jewish interpretation. There's a midrash that says the angel Gabriel pushed him. just as the king walked in, Gabriel gave him a little shove, so he fell on the couch. I'm not sure I subscribe to that. It's kind of funny. So anyway,
Who knows?
you know, so the king walks in, Haman's laying on the couch with the queen, and the king, probably already expecting the worst of Haman at this point, says, will he even molest the queen while she's still with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Remember that he covered his head in grief a minute ago? Here they cover his face. This may actually be when he was killed. The covering of the face is a poetic way of talking about an execution often. Usually it's the covering of the head, but this may actually be where he's killed. In any case, this is where he's as good as dead, right? This is where it's decided. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, helpfully says, a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. I mean, it just all goes bad all at once, doesn't it? It all goes off the rails. And Haman, in the space of 24 hours, not even.
You kind of wonder, I mean, there's something else going on that Haman was no longer, the top guy in the king's favor, or otherwise he's just so easily shifted from one extreme to the other.
Well, I think that the fact that he's the one that the king chooses to lead Mordecai around. Because remember, Mordecai said, make it one of your most distinguished princes that leads me around. I think the king still thought highly of of Haman right up until the moment he realized what Haman had done. But yeah, I mean, and then that's that. And again, that sounds like what Mom talked about, the, you know, beheading the engineers, right, that built the bridge. That's about typical for Xerxes, probably. And then it just keeps coming. The same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to him. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So the two Jews in the story now own all of Haman's wealth. And the signet ring, what does a signet ring mean? If you get the king's signet ring, what?
An official power to be stamped on.
Exactly. He's
Yeah.
trusting you, right, with his authority, his power. He can seal these documents in the king's name. He can stamp these documents in the king's name. He can, you know, pass laws and pass proclamations. And the king has now entrusted him with that power. That's what kings do when they don't want to work too much, right? They just have other people do it.
Well, that's what Haman was, he was like a chief of staff.
Yeah,
Chief
chief of
staff,
staff. Good.
you
Chief
know,
of
it's the
staff is a
things
good word.
here. There's
Yeah.
some things here you gotta sign. No, don't worry about reading it. We've looked them all over. Just put your signature on here, put your signet ring on here. So he was just doing whatever.
Chief of staff is a good way to describe it, and that's what Haman did, and that's now, Mordecai now has that job. So everything Haman had is now in the possession of Esther and Mordecai.
What we know of Xerxes from Esther, it's probably good that he gives other people his power. And
Probably so. It's probably good that other people, he surrounds himself with other people.
This came up at work recently, the difference between a principal and an agent.
Yeah.
If you're an agent, you're acting for somebody else, but if you're that person's principal, you can act as somebody
Yeah.
else. So that's more what the king's ring would allow you to do.
Yeah, I think that's good distinction. Yeah. Not just the agent, you're acting in the king's name. I just am reminded when Jesus talks about God exalting the humble and humbling the exalted. and that this is, I mean, exhibit A is the story of Haman and Mordecai and Esther. All right, it's 8:30, so we need to wind up. We're going to pick up next week in chapter 8, verse 3 of Esther. And we're going to see the last act of this story because it's not over yet. Because there's still a little matter of the fact that the proclamation got passed, right? And the king can't just
Take it back.
take it back, apparently. I don't know why. That seems a bad way to run the government, but the king can't just take it back. And so now we got to deal with this and see what happens next. All right. Thanks everyone for your comments.